This is our topic, ISO Technical Report 10013-2001. This is otherwise known as the Guidelines for Quality Management System. Now, just for updates, look at this. The latest standard when it comes to documenting your quality management system is that already of the 10,013 2021. This is latest right here, this one. Okay, so this is old version. I still have to get used to saying old version. We've been using ISO Technical Report 10,013-2001 as guidelines on how do we document your quality management system. It has been already replaced by ISO 10,013-2021 version. As to what the changes are, we'll be setting another webinar for that, just to focus on what are the changes between the 10,013-2001 and that of 10,013-2021. Our objective today is to really understand, according to 10,013, what should be included in your documents and how should you document that. Of course, this is already withdrawn. This is the predecessor, the ISO 10,013-1995. I'm just going to talk with you today about three simple things. Number one is what should be documented. Is that clear? No? So this is, of course, in accordance to the 10,013 requirements and that of the ISO 9001. That's the first, what should be documented. Second would be, how do we document it? All right, I think you'd also need to understand how do you document it, and most importantly, how do you control? Because again, document control and control of records are a crucial part of your quality management system implementation. And of course, lastly, who are the personality involved in the management of your documents in your QMS? Okay, no big deal. Just three very simple talking points today. So first things first, let's do a document review, shall we? Now, in a document review, you would already understand what minimum documentation requirements should you set up in your management system. Are we clear on this? So just to end all, debate, arguments, discussion on, Jong, what should we include? Do we really have to have a quality manual? Okay, what do you think? You may want to go to the chat box if you're watching this live from Facebook. Do you also keep a quality manual? Did you know that the quality manual is actually optional in the new standard? So these questions and more are actually subject of a lot of documentation debate. So let's proceed. Now, these are the minimum documentation requirements. I hope you're watching this in a computer or a laptop, hopefully not a mobile phone, because I'll be showing to you some text here. So it might be quite small. So just kindly manage if you're using this in a mobile or watching this from a mobile device. Maybe you can zoom in. Okay, now look at this. These are the minimum documentation requirements. So I'll walk you through the clause by clause requirements. Are you ready? So as we all know, ISO 9001-2015 have about how many clauses? 10 clauses, right? From clause 1 to clause 10. But of course, the documentation requirements would start from clause 4. We all know that. I would assume that you understand the foundations of your QMS. So clause 4 is context of the organization, clause 5 is leadership and commitment, clause 6 would be your planning, clause 7 is support, clause 8 is operations, clause 9 is performance evaluation, and finally clause 10 is improvement. We all know that. Now the question here is, what should be documented from those clauses when you are implementing QMS? Get ready. Here we go. So 4.1, look at this. 4.1, like I said, my assumption here is that you already have at least a foundation of your QMS. You understand the clause by clause requirements. 4.1 apparently, there are no documentation requirements there. It is nice to have. Okay, what is 4.1 again? 4.1 is where we identify our external and internal issues, right? Or if you recall, better known as the SWOT. Is it a must-have? It is nice to have. So there are two things you need to watch out for here in documentation. Must have and nice to have. So this one is obviously a nice to have because there's no mention there. 4.2 is the interested parties, right? We are we should determine who are the interested parties in our respective organizations, like your suppliers, customers, your regulatory agencies, top management, employees. These are all the interested parties, and according to the standard, we need to capture their needs, expectations, and requirements. The question here is this: do we need to document that? According to the technical report 10,013, and of course that of ISO 9001 2015, there's no mention here that it is a must-have document. Because when you go to the ISO 9001 documentation requirements, you can find there a statement that says this information should be a documented information, and it should be made available, and most importantly, it should be maintained. Those are very important statements. Okay? So whenever you see those words, it should be maintained as a documented information, and it should be made available. There's no going around it. It is non-negotiable. You need to present that as a document. That's why we call it must-have documentation. Are we following? Are we still on the same page here? All right. So 4.1 and 4.2 is nice to have. Now, here is the first must-have. The first must-have is 4.3, maintain scope. Okay. So we all know that 4.3 is the scope of your QMS. Now, of all the documents, you thought the SWOT and the interested parties matrix should be really a must-have document, but it is not. The must-have document here is that of 4.3, because try to review your ISO 9001 2015. You can really it's explicitly stated there that these document called the scope should be in black and white. I mean, it's not stated like that. It should be in black and white, but it's mentioned there that it should be maintained as a documented information, and most importantly, it should be made available. Are we following this? I also made some notes here on the last column. This is for audit purposes. So we'd probably be discussing this in our later webinar. So this is where you actually evaluate the accuracy of the scope right here. So you'd need to check whether they have documented it by including the boundaries, the locations. If they have exclusions in the scope, did they justify that? You know what I'm saying? So the substance of the document, in other words. So this part right here is the form requirement. This part right here is the substance requirement. Because it's one thing to just put that in black and white. It's also another whether they have adequately documented that. Are you following this? All right, stay with me here. Okay, now next is this 4.4. So 4.4 we all know is QMS and its procedures, or QMS and its different process that we use. We know that in the new QMS, it is actually discretionary upon the part of the organization to determine what are the needed procedures. Unlike its predecessors, I mean, the old versions of the ISO 9001, the standard here gives you that free hand. As to what procedures are you going to include in your quality management system. So, having said that, you have to keep an inventory of those procedures, all right? Or you may want to keep a records master list which contains all of the procedures that you have documented. The question here is this: what procedures are we going to document? That's a very good question, right? Say you're a document controller and a process owner comes to you and say, okay, should we document this? What's the answer to that? The answer to that is, of course, it is up to you. Because the standard says that the organization shall determine procedures needed by the quality management system. So you decide what is needed. Now, there's also two very important criteria in documentation, one of which is complexity of the activity or the process. So the more complex your process is, I think it would make sense if you put this into documentation so that, when it's documented, you have a reference guide, you can refer to it. That's precisely the reason why you document it. Complexity. All right. We're trying to answer the question here, what should be included in the documentation? So complexity is one of which. And the other criteria is, of course, that of competence. What do we mean competence, John? Let's say, for example, you have a lot of new starters in the organization. Majority of your workforce are new starters. So they're just starting on the job. They just joined recently. There are still some competency gaps. That's why we're saying it's competence. The more competency gaps you have in an organization, the more reason you need to document these activities into documented procedures. Did you get that? So the standard, the ISO 9001, doesn't really prescribe or explicitly tell you that you should document this, you should document that. These are the procedures you need to have. Instead, when it comes to procedure, you decide, okay? You decide what these procedures are that you are going to document. So it helps if you have some certain criteria. Say, criteria, like I said, on complexity. The more complex, of course, you need to document that. Criteria on competence. Do we have highly competent or new starters in the organization? Hence, we also need to put that into writing. Those are the only two criteria. However, in managing all our different ISO projects, what we found helpful is adding this criteria on impact of the process. If it's a high impact process, we should document that. All right. We also added the criteria on value of the process. If the procedure is highly valuable, when I say highly valuable, the benefits that we get out of documenting the procedure is high. The more reason we should document that. Are you following this so far? Okay, so we're answering the question here, first and foremost, what should be documented? And we said that 4.3, the scope should be documented. The procedures based on what you need should be documented. All right, there is no certain set of numbers of procedures that you need to have. Let's say, okay, there are 30 or 100 procedures that you need to have. No, it depends. It is up to you. It's discretionary upon your organization, what is needed by your QMS, and then follow those criteria. Okay, let me move on. I just plan to go up to clause 6 in the interest of time. So now 5.2, maintained policy. Okay, maintained policy should be documented. All right, so let's make that clear once and for all, because there are a lot of questions that do we really need to document the policy? The answer is yes. So 5.2 should be documented. So that means it's a must-have document. All right, so no going around it. 5.3, we all know, is roles, responsibilities, and authorities. That's where we develop our organizational structure. It is nice to have. Look at 6.1. 6.1, what is this? Actions to address risk and opportunities, right? So this is where we do identify the risk, we assess the risk, we come up with control measures, and guess what? It's a nice to have documentation. So you'd be surprised now. Oh, so that means it's not a must-have documentation? Well, according to 9001, it is under the category which says it should be discretionary upon the organization to the extent necessary. There goes the exact words. I just used that. If you read the standard, it says there, to the extent necessary, the organization shall maintain documented information, and 6.1 is under that category. So now, it doesn't mean, though, that you should also not put this into writing just simply because it is nice to have according to the standard. Your organization can mandate this. So in other words, there are two types of documentation now. Type A is the must-have, which is prescribed by the standard. Type B is the nice-to-have, which is prescribed or mandated by your organization. It may not be a requirement by the standard, but yes, it is required by your organization. So you still have to put that into black and white. Case in point, your risk registers. Are we following this? So because your organization would deem it proper to say, okay, let's put that into writing because it's better if we refer to that. So that's why you have risk registers or you have your risk assessment matrix. But technically speaking, as far as the ISO standard is concerned, it is a nice to have document. It is written under category B that says the organization, to the extent necessary, shall maintain this documented information. Having said that, when we go to 6.2 on the quality objectives, it is a must-have document. All right? It is a must-have document. So this is, again, just clearing the air. This is, once and for all, clarifying that confusion as to what really should be included in our documentation. And the quality objectives is a must-have. Absence of this is a non-conformance. Are you following this? Absence of this is an issue as far as documentation is concerned. So, what do you think? So now you have seen at least this initial part, because there's so many the documentation here that should be included in your documents. There are 31 of them to be exact, but in the interest of time, let me go to my next topic. What I'd like to emphasize here with you is that there are specific documentation requirements that are prescribed by your ISO 9001. And Let me open the standard here for your further reference, all right? So let me repeat that just to do a quick recap here before I go to my next talking point. Uh, there are two categories of documentation here. The first one I would call is a Type A document. What is a Type A document? A Type A document is specifically required by ISO 9001, while a Type B document is a document that may be prescribed by your organization. Let me show you what I mean here. Okay, let me go to the standard just for you to see this. Okay, so let me go to the standard now. I'll be sharing this with you in a short while. Let me go to 7.5. Okay, now let's talk about document control, documented information. So 7.5 is documented information in the ISO standard. All right, let me just open this. Give me 1 second. Okay. All right, and for those who are watching us in Facebook, thank you for joining us today. I think we should already start requesting for an increase in budget in our Zoom capacity. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your time and presence with us today. Okay, now I hope you can see my screen there. I'm showing to you the standard itself to explain to you further. All right. So earlier I was talking about what should be documented. Okay, what should be documented. Now, 7.5 is documented information as far as ISO 9001:2015 is concerned. So this is the standard, right? This is the ISO 9001:2015. Look, this is what I was talking about. Look at this. So in 7.5, by the way, this is the exact clause here in the ISO 9001 that says how do you manage your documentation. So first things first, look at this. Read this. I'll read this, okay? The organization's QMS shall include, okay, A, look at this, A, documented information required by this standard. All right, that's A. I'll explain that in a short while. So, in other words, there are DI or documented information specifically required by this international standard. And I have showed you three of those: the scope, the quality policy, the quality objectives, targets, and programs. Is that clear? Those are required by the ISO standard. And let me explain that further. But before that, let me go to the second category. Obviously, there's a second category here. B is documented information determined by the organization as being necessary. What does it mean? In other words, on top of those documented information that the ISO 9001 requires, there may also be other documented information that may be required by your organization. So this can be on top of what is prescribed by ISO 9001. Did you get that? So this is where I got my nice to have and must have. In other words, my type A, I'm calling this type A just for distinction, is a must-have document. Okay, I'll just write MH here, must-have. And the type B document, which is being necessary, so it's up to the organization, I would call this my nice-to-have, NTH. Okay, nice-to-have. Are you getting this? So these are the two categorization of first and foremost documents that we need to understand before we even go to, okay, how do we control the documents? You cannot control what you do not know, right? So first things first, you need to agree as a team in your QMS what should be included in our documentation before you even start discussing how do you document it, right? That's where document control comes in. The document control is actually the easy part, all right? It's the easy part. Now, let me explain this further, the must-have, just really, for you to be clarified on this. The must-have document. It says here, these are documented information required by this international standard, all right? Documented information required by the international standard. So, let me go to 4.1. I said a while ago that 4.1 and 4.2 is nice to have, right? While 4.3 is a must-have. Where does it say that it's a must-have document? Am I just making this up? You'd probably be wondering. So let's see what's our basis here. Why is it a must-have document? Okay, now let me scroll up. I'll go to 4.3. Okay, let me go to 4.3. Just give me 1 second. Here, okay, fantastic. 4.3. I said earlier that 4.3 is the first ever must-have document, meaning this is non-negotiable. You cannot go around this requirement. You need to present this. all right, as part of your documentation. So what's our basis here? Okay, here, look at this. Okay, look at this. I hope those watching in Facebook Live or while they're using a mobile device, I hope you can manage maybe zooming in into this. So I'm showing you the details now, the standard. Look at this, look at this. Let me read this. The scope of the organization's QMS shall be, look at that, available and be maintained as documented information. Period. Now, what do you take out of that? When it says shall be available, by all means, you need to document this scope of the QMS. All right. So this is oftentimes referred to as an SDD. What is an SDD? This is a scope definition document. So it's either written in loose leaf or a separate documentation, or this is integrated into your quality manual if you are keeping a quality manual. Like I said, a quality manual is now optional in the new ISO 9001:2015. So if you keep a quality manual as required by your organization, then this SDD will be conveniently integrated into the quality manual. But it's also not required that you should put that in a quality manual. You may have it as a separate document, or you may even post this on the wall. It doesn't matter, for as long as you have documented it. Did you get that? Shall be available and be maintained as documented information. Period. That's your basis there. Okay, now, to further understand that, let's go to 4.1, because I mentioned a while ago that 4.1 is actually nice to have. It is not a must-have. Okay, and we all know that your 4.1 is your COTO, context of the organization. This is where we do the SWOT analysis, right? Strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and all that. And as a matter of fact, we have this in black and white. We have identified all of those issues. We put that into writing. We make it part of our strategic plan. And that's okay. Nothing wrong with that, because it's a nice have. Your organization deem it necessary for your QMS. However, here's the however. As far as your 9001:2015 is concerned, the only mention here is, look at this, shall monitor and review information. How is that different? Okay, how is that different? Shall monitor and review information. How is that different from that statement that I earlier showed to you in 4.3 that says shall be made available and shall be maintained as a documented information? Quite different, right? That one is quite explicit. When we say shall be made available, you need to present that when asked. That's why we're talking about retrievability, and most importantly, the most important part there is that document, that SDD, that 4.3, that document shall be maintained as a documented information. When we say maintain, you have to update it. That's maintenance. You have to make sure that it's of the latest version. Now, all those stipulations, all those specifications, all those explicit requirements mentioned in 4.3 are not found here in 4.1. It only says, shall monitor and review information. My fellow ISO practitioners, auditors, document controllers, QMRs, this is a document that you just have to you maintain, yes, okay, but it is discretionary upon you. All right, so it's a nice to have document. So you still have to monitor and review the information, but as to how you document that, it is really up to you. It is not specifically required, prescribed by the standard that you have to present. Of course, it's expected. When we implement this, the organization would say, oh yeah, let's put this into writing so that we can review this during management review. Remember, when we do management review towards the end, later part of the year, we review this, right? So if you recall, this is your SWOT, okay, which basically is, again, another very important question, which we always receive in AGF. How often do we review our SWOT? Right? Because basically this is your SWOT, understanding the organization in its context. And look at this, you shall monitor and review your SWOT. But it didn't say that you have to put this into a documented information. So again, to the extent necessary, it's up to you. Are you getting this? So it's a nice to have document. Again, it's always better to have references. But technically speaking here, you may actually exclude this from your documentation. No? Are we on the same page here? Now, let me go to 4.2 just to again further understand this. Look at 4.2. Is there a mention here that this document should be made available and shall be maintained as a documented information? Pretty much the same as your 4.1. So if you look at your 4.1 here, it says here the organization shall, 4.2, sorry, the organization shall monitor and review information. So no mention of, shall be made available and shall be maintained as a documented information. In other words, your interested parties matrix, because we also do create a matrix, right? A list of all our interested parties, what are their needs, expectations, or requirements, and how do we comply with that? We all know that these are sources of risk, and hence we document it. But technically speaking, again, when you look at the documentation requirement of the standard, it is nice to have. Are we clear? Okay? Now, your task, your mission, should you accept it? Now it's becoming a mission impossible type. Okay, because I couldn't cover everything here in just 1 hour. I hope you do understand that. So your mission here is to go to the standard, all right, and identify those clauses that says should be made available and should be maintained as a documented information. Can you do that for me, please? Okay, that's how you should do it. So, are we good on that? All right, so that you would know what should be documented. I could probably cover clause 4 up to 10. At least you have an idea now. Okay, now let me go further here. Okay, let me move further here. So on document control. Look at this. So again, still on 7.5, because 7.5 basically is where document control comes in, and the documented information. This is a topic that we could not probably cover obviously in 1 hour. So I promise you we're going to do another version of this, so stand by for that. We'll have to continue our discussion on documented information. As next week, we're going to talk about risk management. We have a wonderful speaker next week. Hopefully, he can get inside that. Okay. Okay, so 7.5 is documented information. So look at this. According to 7.5, it all matters. Depends on the size of the organization. So I mentioned earlier the complexity of the process, right? Did I mention that? So it all depends. No? So you cannot compare your documentation with the other organization, because we all come from different sizes, types of activities. You have different products and services. Your documentation will vary from one organization to another. But one thing is important here. Well, two things to be exact: complexity of the process. Second is competence of the person. This dictates the amount of documentation you need to have. And so let me go to my second point. I said my first point was to share with you today what should be documented, and I hope we answered that. So the second talking point here would be how to document it. All right. So let's go to further to how do we document it. Okay. Now look at this. So this is the type A and type B that I have mentioned earlier. Type A is required by the ISO standard. Type B would be determined by your organization that may be necessary, so you will add that up into your master list. All right, so you have to have a master list. I hope we're settled on this. The 7.5.1. Now let's go to the how. That's the second talking point I promised to you. The how is creating and updating. Okay, so it says here, when creating and updating documented information, you should, okay, first and foremost check. Now these are very important points here. Number one, okay, look at this. Number one, your documentation must be properly identified, okay, and should be adequately described. We're not talking of the how, all right? Second talking point is the how. Then last would be the roles and responsibilities, which I'll just go over briefly, as we're pressed for time here. So when you are documenting, when you are creating, first, of course, you need to create your document, right? By the way, when we say documented information, okay, when we say documented information, we're referring to the hierarchy of document. Let me repeat that, the hierarchy of document. So in other words, the different levels of documentation. Level 1 would be the quality manual. Level 2 would be the procedure or procedures manual. Level 3 would be your instructions, or you call this your guidelines, or implementing rules and regulations, whatever you call that, which is more detailed than the procedure. It's a detailed document. And you also have level 4, which is the form. And finally, of course, you have records, level 5. And matter of fact, in some organizations, they can be as up to level 8 or level 10. It depends on how do you structure your documentation. So what I just shared with you is a typical hierarchy of documents from level 1 to level 5, which is from QM to records. So that's what we mean by documented information. That is documented information. Now, regardless of the level, it should be properly identified. Okay, regardless of the level, it should be properly identified. So now that we have figured out what should be included in the documents, which procedure, etc., etc., all of those documents should, okay, take note of this. These are really very straightforward, as a matter of fact. Number one, of course, you need to have a title. Number two, there has to be at least some publication date there, or implementation date, or effectivity date. Number three, you may also want to include who is the author of the document. Number four, you may also want to use some reference numbers. Okay, so when we say reference number, it's really up to you how you name your document. So you may come up with your own naming convention. You would probably say AGF QM 01 version A. It can be like that. So if it's a quality manual. So the standard here doesn't tell you exactly what should be the specific naming convention or codification of those documents, for as long as you follow this requirement A, which says your documented information should be identifiable and it should be properly described. Clear? Now, next, format. Look at the format. It says here the format, it's, what do you mean format, John? Format would mean the language that you are going to use. Yes, you can actually write it in the vernacular. Some organizations we work with, they have a master copy that says, you know, this is written in English and all that. And the controlled copies distributed to the different departments are in the local dialect. You can do that. No? So you can feel free to choose which language are you going to use in your documentation. Or you may even be doing electronic documentation. So when you do that, of course, software version, or you may even want to integrate graphics into your documentation, not just pure and simple text or narratives of how do you conduct your activities. Are you following this? So it can be visual flow diagram or screenshots of your systems when you're, of course, doing, when you're using, for example, an enterprise resource plan software. So it can just be screenshots of those. And then that's it. So it's properly described. So format can be in either whatever language you choose, the software version, the graphics, and of course, most importantly, the media. So you also need to decide whether you're going for a manual, you know, the traditional manual documentation. I personally would go for that. I'm an old school documentation guy that would still rather prefer looking at the paper, smell the paper. And for me, I think personally, it's more, I can relate to it. I can connect to it. I can easily understand and digest what's in it. If you're not that person, then you can do electronic. No, I would say electronic, of course, has more advantage than that of, you know, manual. So because it's easier to upload documents, you can just distribute it no matter where the location of your process owners. You can remove that from the portal and replace it with a new one when there are revisions or changes. The request for a review and approval would pop up in the inbox of the author, and so on and so forth. So it's easier, I would say, when you look at the digital electronic platform when it comes to the documentation than the old paper and pen. No? So it has its pros and cons. So okay, now that's for the format. And then next, of course, would be the review and approval for suitability and adequacy. Do not forget that your documents, whether it's a quality manual, a procedure manual, it has to have at least a review and approval matrix at the bottom of this document. Well, it doesn't have to be at the bottom though, but it may be in a totally separate page, or it can be the front page for all I care. Wherever you put that, the review and the approval should be there. Okay, so we call this the review and approval matrix. You all know this, no? The prepared by, reviewed by, approved by. So make sure it has that, so that we know that all these documents are, of course, official. No? So it's not just a piece of paper, especially if it has no signature whatsoever. Are we following this? Excuse me. Okay, now moving on. I'm down to my last 10 minutes here. You also need to, this is where the control of document comes in, all right? Now, basically, let me simplify this. Let me simplify. The standard is saying here that the documents should be, first and foremost, the documents should be available and suitable, okay? Where and when it is needed. So now that we have identified what are these documents, now that we know how do we document it, of course, on a very high level here, the description, the title, the reference number, and all that. Now, how do we control it? Okay, so that's what 7.5.3 is all about. So you have first to understand where are you going to distribute this, the availability of the document. So if you have about 5 different departments, all right, you have probably accounting, finance, operations, sales and marketing, and let's say human resource. So if you decide that, okay, I have to make sure that this documented information are available in these respective departments, I'm going to distribute this to the respective departments. So that's what we mean by availability. In other words, the distribution. So you can see here the distribution, the access. Not only that, when you distribute it, you would also want to understand how are you going to retrieve it when there are changes in those documents that you have just distributed. So did you get that? So make sure that you make it available, all right, and suitable where and when it is needed. So you decide. It's your call. It's your need, for example. For as long as you can control it, you can retrieve it. This is where a master copy would come in. You stamp it with a red master copy stamp, and then probably all the distributed copies would be stamped with a blueprint that says controlled copy. And if it's a controlled copy, you need to retrieve that whenever there are revisions or changes in the master copy. Are you following this? All right. So that's what we mean by distribution, access, retrieval, and use. No? So, and of course, not only that, once you have identified where you're going to make this available, how are you going to distribute it, you also need to protect it. How do you protect it from loss of confidentiality or loss of integrity? Simple. Nobody can change a document unless it goes through the document control process. What is the document control process? Come up first with a draft, forward that to the document controller. The document controller will route it to the person who will review and approve. And once it's reviewed and approved, it is enrolled in your QMS system and it is distributed by the document controller to where it should be made available and when it is needed. Clear? Do not forget that. Simplify this. Simplify this. Just simplify this. And of course, do not forget your storage and preservation. All right, where do you store these documents? It should not be exposed to elements. It should be properly kept. Probably if you have a record room, that would be great. Where access is controlled as well. Where it's protected probably from dust or heat or worse, fire. All right. So because those are assets. And of course, the control of changes basically would mean that, like I said earlier, nobody can change a document unless reviewed and approved by your approving authority. It also helps for you to have an approval matrix, no, or a review and approval matrix. If it's changes pertaining to the quality manual, it can only be reviewed and approved by the QMR. All right. If these are changes or revisions on the form, well, the QMR may not be necessarily needed in the review. It may be up to the level only of the department manager. You can also do that. Again, that's just a suggestion. So you may do it whatever you want for as long as you control the version, the changes, and the review and approval matrix is clear. And of course, retention and disposition. Lastly, let me talk about retention and disposition. I understand some of the participants are coming from government agencies here. For your retention, please refer to your NAP, the National Archives of the Philippines. That's a Republic Act. You are duty-bound to follow that. You are obliged to follow the stipulations of the Republic Act in terms of how long are you going to retain your records. So it's specified there that if it's government records, for example, you may have records pertaining to commission on audit reports. What else? Department of Budget and Management memorandum circulars. What else? DTI. the Civil Service Commission. Now, all of these regulatory agencies, they do produce a lot of external records for us, external records, right? So there are two, internal, external. So these external records have to be retained. And your question would be here, how long are we going to retain that? Go to the National Archives of the Philippines. It's specified there, okay? It's usually about 5 years, 10 years, depending on the type of that record. Now, if you're a private sector or coming from the private sector organization or a private company, you decide how long are you going to retain your document, okay? Active years would be 1 year, inactive years would be another 1 year before you finally dispose it. And when you speak of disposal, the disposal, of course, should also go through approval. So nobody can dispose an obsolete document or a document sitting in the archive in the last 5 years, and then all of a sudden we're going to dispose that. This disposal should, go through some review and approval board as well. No? So which should be a committee under your documents and records control division, department, team, whatever you call that. That's how you manage your retention and disposition. Are we learning here? Okay, are we following so far? I have about 4 minutes left, and we're going to call this a program for today. Now, lastly, I said 3 points. The first, of course, is that of what should be documented. So don't forget, you go to 7.5. It says there type A, type B, right? And then the second point, I just mentioned to you simply in a very summarized fashion, how do you document it? That's the document control. And then the last point would be who are the persons responsible, who are the personalities involved here? Okay, well, first and foremost, of course, you have the documents and records controller. You may have your different terms in your organization, whatever you call it. This person should be responsible in controlling, managing, distribution, including that access, retrieval. This is the documents controller, right? Documents and records controller. So the role of the documents and records controller is to ensure that all the documents and records that you use in your QMS is properly accounted for. It's listed in a master list of procedures or documents. It's listed in a master list of records with tracking of version numbers, with tracking of effectivity date, with tracking of who is the author, when will this be disposed, and so on and so forth. The document controller is a key personality in your documents and records control. I guess goes without saying, right? Goes without saying. However, let me just clarify this. I have 2 minutes left. Let me clarify this. The document controller is not an author. Okay, so this is a misconception. In most organizations, they will say, "Oh, let the document controller write the procedure." No, okay. The author of the document is the process owner. So the process owner will write the document. The document controller, though, will enroll that process in the system. Will ensure that the versions of these documents are up to date. Whenever there are changes, the document controller will notify the process owners. Okay, there are changes. Let me retrieve that old document. Here's the new one. That's his or her role. Okay? So, and another thing, he doesn't keep all the records. The records are kept by the process owners. The custodians of the records are the respective process owners. The only records kept by the document controller, of course, records pertaining to the quality management system mandatory procedures, which these are just copies though. No? So these are documents requests processing form that are filled up. Other than that, all of those records are kept by the respective departments. When you speak of internal quality audit records, of course, that's kept by the auditing team, not the document controller. All right, is that clear? All right. And then, of course, the document controller, like I said, plays a very important role here. Of course, you have the QMR. The QMR supports the implementation of the document control process. The QMR plays a very important role in the identification part. Remember, 3 points we discussed today. Identify what documents are needed, must have, nice to have. That's the role of the QMR. So the QMR should spearhead that. What should be included? What are strategic procedures that should be included in the documentation? Why did we select these procedures? Why did we exclude this procedure? That's the QMR. All right? And then lastly, the process owners. Lahat po tayo are process owners. Tayo pong lahat, process owners tayo. May role din po tayo. Ano po ang role natin? Tayo po, we have to take good care of those procedures that are assigned to us because we are process owners. So when we keep a controlled copy in our custody, we have to safe keep this document because this document is an accountable form, especially if it's a controlled copy. So for example, let's say We go home. Can we also bring along this document? Okay, okay, you have to ask permission. Okay, can we photocopy this and distribute? Okay, no, cannot be. All right. So that's our responsibility as process owners as well.